Hey, ladies and gents, happy Monday. Happy Monday. It's a beautiful day over here in London. Blue skies, sun's out. It's been a good day. Actually, it didn't start that good. This morning I went outside to jump on my bike to ride to work. Yeah, my bike got stolen overnight. I know. Don't feel bad for me. Feel bad for the bloke who stole it. I feel so bad for him. He didn't realise that the back brakes are broken. I'm really worried about his safety. So if you happen to have stolen my bike overnight, first of all, well done. You're very clever. I have no idea how you picked my lock. Amazing, but just be careful. Can you return it tonight? If you did steal it, return it tonight. I go to bed about 9:30. If you return it after that, I won't see you, so I can't judge you. Leave it. It'll be such a nice start to my Tuesday if I walk outside and my bike's back there. Just be careful though, because those back brakes are really quite dangerous. Anyway, it's a ridiculous start to this podcast, but let me just move on forward because it's only going to get better in a big way, actually. So the guest today is a filmmaker straight out of the United States by the name of Andrew Morgan. For those of you who have Netflix, I'm sure you've heard of the documentary he's just released. It's been massive all around the world, a documentary called The True Cost, which looks at the world of fast fashion. It looks at the stories of the people who are behind the scenes, the people in the factories making the clothes that we buy from the big brands all around the world. It looks at the psychological effects it has on their life. It looks at the environmental effects. It looks at what big business are doing in order to make us believe that their products are ethical, in order to make us believe that what we're wearing is completely okay and only benefiting everyone involved. But Andrew Morgan shines a light on this scene. He does it in such an amazing way. He doesn't do it in a way that shames anybody. In fact, he just opens up the conversation. His idea with this documentary was just to raise awareness about what is going on in this world of fashion. It's a project he'd been working on for 2 years with his team, and it's an emotional roller coaster. I mean, it's a beautifully shot film, but it's a devastating story to hear some of the, just the psychological impacts and just the devastation that this scene is having on so many lives of those in the fast fashion world, in the production of the fast fashion. I get a chance to sit down with Andrew and ask him a whole heap of questions, just quietly. I know you're not supposed to admit this, but the podcast is young. I told Andrew as well, I couldn't believe that I actually locked in an interview with him. I emailed him a couple of weeks ago just thinking he'd say, mate, nah, I'm not that interested. He emailed me right back. He's like, yeah, like, let's do this. So I've been buzzing for the last couple of weeks to be able to bring this one to you. So glad I finally can. If you're into it and you really, really like it, make sure you jump on to tysonpopplestone.com/podcast. Click on the episode there, the show notes, that'll link you to some other really interesting articles and information about this. If you haven't seen it yet, highly recommend you go and watch The True Cost after this interview. I'm pretty sure you're going to want to anyway. Guys, before we do start, the last couple of weeks I've mentioned that I've got a newsletter going. Apparently I can't talk. Monday afternoon, I need a coffee. I'm not having one for another 9 months, but that's another story. I send out a newsletter every couple of weeks with updates, information, anything that you might be interested from the website. It's got a whole heap of my blogs. It sends the podcast straight to your inbox. So if that'll make your life a little bit easier, also send you a few little treats here and there, any updates that you might be interested in. Jump on board, tysonpopplestone.com/newsletter. I'll send you a welcome email, which is my version of like a digital cuddle. Apart from that, I think we're pretty much right to go. Oh, I'm 30 on Wednesday. I know, it's Monday today, so send your presents quick. Anyway, big love, guys. Hope you enjoyed this as much as I did.
I'm the soul challenger, I'm the road damager. Now behold the cold and the straight magical. Cause the sky brings flowers and the strong grow weary. The heroes spill blood in the blast and the fury. Pray on the power and pray to your father. Cause all of the quakes in the universe resonate to your heartbeat and your faith.
I heard about you for the first time. It was probably only about 3 or 4 months ago. I was chatting with a guy called Ryan Nicodemus. He's a blogger from a blog called The Minimalist. And at the end of the interview, I asked him, I said, man, like, is there anything at the moment that you're absolutely loving? Anything that you recommend my audience go and check out? And the first thing he said was, yeah, there's a documentary. It's just come out on Netflix called The True Cost, which was the first time I heard of that. I'm such a big fan of Ryan Nicodemus that I ran inside, checked out what The True Cost was, and man, was really struck by exactly what this fast fashion scene was. I think initially I was surprised by the fact that there were so many different components that went into this fast fashion scene. And over the week, I've been thinking about how to do an introduction to this particular episode, and I thought, you know what, rather than me try and explain everything that goes into this fast fashion scene and try and give a nice little bite-sized description, I thought I would throw it to you, the man who's probably become an expert in the last, 12 months of answering the question. When people ask you what is the true cost actually about, how do you combine all the factors in to give them a nice little answer?
Yeah, well, we'll see how I do. I think for me, the true cost is it's a film about the people and the places behind the things that we wear. And I think I came to a realization that I knew very, very little about where my clothes came from, and I was curious to find out. And as simple as that sounds, it set off a journey that took me and my team around the world a couple times over, and really opened the door on this world of enormous and often unseen impacts that come from something as simple as clothing. And the term fast fashion has been something that's kind of been coined to mirror fast food, because fashion, historically has been this good that we've created and we've held on to and we've cherished and we've passed down and we've repaired. And only very, very recently in our history has there been just an enormous push, a very business-driven push to create and to communicate fashion as a story of throwaway goods, to make fashion something that comes into and goes out of our life at a really accelerated pace. And that has brought with it just this world of impacts, as you can imagine, that show up in regards to the health of our planet, scarcity of our resources, but also to some of the most vulnerable, some of the poorest of the working poor in our world. So yeah, it is kind of a dizzying film. I think I try to put into the film what I experienced over the course of a couple of years, and it is I think it's difficult to describe because in a way, it asks more questions than it answers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, 100%. I think one of the things that really stood out to me is I understand being on the consumer side of things, it's nice to be able to go into a shop like H&M or Zara or Gap and buy a nice cheap product and be able to take it home. And if you get sick of it, hey, it's only another $5 before you can get another new shirt. But I think the thing that really opened my eyes was, I guess, the psychological effect and the environmental effects that it's having on so many people. But what really stood out to me was the psychological effects. I guess the lives that these people in Bangladesh, these people who are working in these big factories, the things that they were actually having to endure in order for us to get our cheap clothes. And I saw that you spent a lot of time abroad trying to speak with these people. Man, what kind of mindset did you come back with from being a bloke who, had been blind, like so many of us are, to the impact of fast fashion? What were some of the big things that stood out to you from meeting these people who, their hands are dirty and their sweat's literally on our clothes?
Yeah, well, I think a lot. I learned a lot from them, and I think a lot of what I try to put into the film is an attempt to really let them speak for themselves rather than speaking for them. Because what I found was story after story of incredibly bold, brave people, oftentimes women, over 80% women in this industry, and I was really, really struck by the humanity and the hope in the face of an enormously oppressive, regressive, exploitative system that they find themselves working in. And it's just so it's so interesting to me the more I think about it, because I think I, like maybe a lot of people listening, I grew up here in the United States. And I always had this very simple story explained to me when it came to clothing or when it came to anything else in my life. And that was that, these things that come into my life, these things that I buy, like at a shopping mall, they come from other places, they come from faraway countries. And these countries, the people there are so poor that they really, really need this work. So it's okay, whatever happens. And yeah, there's this kind of, I think a lot of people have this kind of lingering suspicion that there's probably some really nasty stuff in those supply chains, but it's kind of always been washed over because it's like, well, this is a rung up on the ladder towards prosperity for these countries. And there's been an enormously inconvenient, I think disastrous story told about development in relation to these industries. And what I experienced firsthand in country after country after country after country is a story that's so much more complex, so much more dangerous and deadly. And I think the thing that gets left out when you look at this stuff on a really broad global level is the fact that these are human beings. And as simple as that sounds to you, that was the life-changing thing for me. Because preparing for the film, we were doing all this research, and I was with academics, and I was looking at all this data, and I even had my walls covered with all the GDPs and all the this and that. And then you go to these places and you spend time with people, and you look in a single working mother's eyes who's working literally around the clock and is not making enough to support her child in the city slums. And what strikes you is that this is a person, and this is this person's one experience on this planet, and that, similar to me, she has a child, and she has a personality, and she has and I just, I think for me it sort of just it uprooted this really simple, clean, convenient story, and what it led to was this this incredibly indicting, but also incredibly inviting opportunity to look at the world in a new way, which is to own the responsibility, to own the connection that I have, but also not to just get stuck in the stagnation of like guilt, but to really move forward and say, could we do this another way? And I think the really hopeful part is, in so many areas here, we really can do that.
Dude, it's so funny you say it, because I think there was certainly a lot of hope. I left the film. Honestly, I went into it and I was thinking, oh no, like, is this guy going to be about just not being into fashion? And do I have to just, just wear one t-shirt and one pair of pants? And what I loved going into it, and then following up with listening to some of your emails, your interviews, and seeing you in some of the interviews, I was like, hang on a sec, all right, this dude, he's a pretty fashionable guy. I like the stuff he wears. And the idea for me originally was, okay, look, there's so many cheap options for fashion, and as you say, there's a lot of excuses put on by big companies, big business, and I'm quite happy to swallow it into a lot of the time when they tell me that, hey, without this, these guys would have absolutely nothing to be able to do. They'd be earning no money. So, isn't a couple of dollars a day better than nothing a day? And the more I listen to you, and the more I watch the documentary, and I guess just dig a little bit deeper into this scene that you've sort of exposed me to, the more I realize that it is just a nice cop out in order to be able to, make a little bit of profit and make sure the money keeps coming to you. And what I've been really interested in asking you is, man, how do you keep your cool when you hear companies saying things like what I've just explained there? And what is a response to a company like that?
Yeah, well, I think it's a great question, and it's a really valid point. So there is no denying that the fashion industry is moving all over the world towards the places where they can get the very cheapest labor. This is the most labor-dependent industry in the world. So from a margin standpoint, the cost of labor is a significant part of the clothing. And by the way, that's why clothing has been, unlike almost any other product in our world, a deflationary product. So clothing has actually gotten cheaper over time. And if you really think about that for a second, compared to technology, compared to food, compared to so many of the other staples in our life, that's an extraordinary quality. And if you really ask the question, why is that? One of the answers is that labor has been pushed down and down and down. So the industry moves around the world into areas where there is the cheapest possible human labor with the lowest amount of oversight. These are areas with very low or no labor union. There's an incredibly it's just like it's like the Wild West. Mm-hmm. And there's no denying, as you say, there's no denying that there is a value in connecting some of these countries to the international market. I'm really not a person who's fundamentally against trade or globalization, but I think where the story gets really, really wrong is when it gets framed, as you mentioned, as a zero-sum game. So the story is based. Here's the options. The options are either we give these people work at inhumane wages that they cannot support their lives. And, they put up with abuse, they put up, buildings collapse, they catch on fire, people die, like the horrendous human rights atrocities. either we do that for this, incredibly low wage, or we pull out of those countries and these people starve to death. And I think, honestly, not to sound crass, I think what I just woke up with one day when we were in the middle of all this is I just asked this really simple question for the first time, and that was, why is that the only option?
Yeah.
Like, in a modern, interconnected world full of goods and services, but also new and better ideas, why have we allowed ourselves to not only look the other way, but to believe that lie? And that story, by the way, is not a neutral story. If you think about it, as you mentioned, the large companies, that story is really productive if you're benefiting from the status quo. That story is really destructive if you're someone who lives inside of that system. So I just think that this is an industry with enormous profit margins. This is an industry around the world, profits accumulated into the trillions of dollars. You have some of the richest people in the world. I mean, in the top 10, in the top 20 are owners of some of these fashion brands. And I just refuse to believe that we can create that much value at the top without bringing it down into the supply chain in a more humane way.
Yeah, that is such an amazing point. And I'm really interested to follow that with just asking a little bit what the response from some of the big companies have been like. Because I think, in all fairness, I watched it and I thought, man, this guy, he could have been a lot harder on some of these companies. It was almost like I left and I was like, oh, I wish he got stuck into these guys because I know so much less about this than what you do. And I feel so passionate, and I'm just so glad you're in the situation that you're in, because I think you're making a lot more of an impact than I would, because my anger would just get in the way. But dude, how have you actually been able to monitor, the frustration and the anger, and I guess dealing with the lies that we're told from the top down from these big companies?
It's really, it's really difficult. And I think one of the things that's unfair about the situation is that these large companies have hundreds of millions of dollars in marketing stories that are told every single day. So when you look at this conversation, they have the megaphone in their hand. And I think a lot of what I wanted to do with the film was to sort of pass the mic to the people that we don't ever hear from. And so, the labor organizers, the folks that are looking at the health of our planet, the workers that are in the middle of it. So I think that very process felt, that felt political to me. That felt actually like a way to do this. And, it's interesting. One of the things that kind of held me back in some ways is two things. First, when I started working on this film, one of the things that hit me was that this is not one of those films where I need to drum up the drama of this issue. It's one of those stories that's so egregious and it's so invisible in plain sight, and any decent human being, of which I think there are many, I felt like, I have a responsibility to serve as a witness and a guide, but I really think if I allow the audience to interact with these ideas and these characters, I think they're going to walk away with a certain righteous indignation. Like, I think anger is a good response from this film. I really do. And I also, the other part of that was I was really careful not to place blame in one particular corner of this, because I think it alleviates responsibility from all of us.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times what it's easy to do in any of these topics is to do the same kind of oversimplification that we're raging against. And I think when you look at, multinational corporations, it's really easy to say they're operating on barbaric levels of greed, on quarterly growth at the expense of everything that all of us care about. Yes, that's completely true. The more true thing, or the more interesting thing to me, is why have we allowed our world to be organized that way? Yeah. And what will it take fundamentally, not just to list a couple of bad actors, but to create some consciousness, to create some like movement in the hearts and minds of people to say that story of business growth at all costs led us from A to B, and it brought with it some good, but it also it carried with it something that needs to be profoundly reworked, and we can't continue to ignore that. So yeah, that's kind of that's the line we walked. And then it was an interesting interaction. I wanted to speak with these companies. I went to very great lengths to get interviews, and we had lengthy conversations. And all the major fast fashion players ended up saying no, and I very simply say that in the film. And then there was quite a lot of anger when the film came out. There was there was a lot thrown around, and I think I ultimately feel like, yeah, I feel like we were fair to them. At the same time, I can't lie and say that they've been best friends of ours since the film.
Is this something that you've always been really passionate about? I mean, you've made an amazing film and it's made a massive impact worldwide, and just on a personal level, I mean, it's completely changed the way I've looked at fashion. I mean, I looked at my cupboard as soon as I'd finished the True Cost film, and I was like, oh my gosh, like there's so much I need to learn. There's so much I need to know. And I've been gradually, my wife and I have been gradually trying to make a transition into, at least being a lot more thoughtful with where it is that we're actually investing our money. But how did this journey start for you, man? What made you want to, put together a film on the fast fashion scene?
Yeah, so I had no background in fashion at all. And I was someone who, went to the mall, bought clothes when I saw something that looked good or was on sale. I picked it up and I didn't think about it. I mean, I was buying very much into the fast fashion supply chains that you see in the film. I had a moment that was one of the more distinct moments of my life. A few years ago, I had just finished up another film and I was getting coffee at a shop here close to my house in Los Angeles, and I was standing in line, kind of half asleep, and I looked down at the cover of the New York Times, and there was a photograph that morning of these two boys that were similar in age to my two boys at home, and it kind of grabbed my eye, and they were standing in front of this huge, almost unending wall of missing person signs, and I picked up the paper and I read that morning about this clothing factory that had collapsed the day before just outside of Dhaka, Bangladesh. And it had taken the lives already at that point, was reported more than 1,000 people, mostly women, some children. And I read that at the time of the collapse, they were making clothing, really cheap clothing for a lot of the brands that I knew and had frequented. I also read that the workers had pointed out the cracks and the flaws in the building that morning, and they'd been forced back in based on just a lack of organization in the labor force. And then I read that a month before there had been another factory in Pakistan, and there had been another collapse. And I remember standing there stunned and thinking two really distinct things. Honestly, I remember thinking, first of all, on just a simple basis, how is it possible that in our modern world we're still doing business in this kind of way that's leading to this kind of loss? And as I was reading, ongoing lessening of human life, and then honestly, on a really personal level, I just thought, how have I never stopped to think about where my clothes come from?
Yeah.
And that was so chilling to me. It was so haunting. Like it just did something inside of me. I brought that paper back to the office. I shared it with my producer. I got on the phone, and the next couple of days I spent time reaching out and talking to people all over the world in different parts of this fashion supply chain, some of the people that you actually end up seeing in the film. And I said, hey, I don't know anything about fashion. I'm a storyteller. I'm a filmmaker. And this is sort of, it's hurting my heart. And it's blowing my mind that there's never been an organized, really accessible story told. And I'm thinking about doing this. And I flew over to London the next week, and I met Livia Firth and Lucy Siegel and Safia Minney and some of the incredible women that you see. And we started putting it together. I mean, I think by the end of that month, I was pretty convinced that it was a film that I was going to make. And from there, it just erupted into this life-changing experience. And it was a very small, humble process. It was me and two close friends that I've known since high school. And we worked with journalists and fixers and labor organizers and people all over the world to kind of build this web of stories. And yeah, the result is something that I'm really proud of. I'm really happy to hear people say things like you just said. I think it's a surreal feeling because it's one of those things that it changed me so personally and so profoundly that it was so rewarding on that level. It was so challenging too. But then now to see it go out and move around the world and have to see other people moved it's just like it's an amazing feeling.
Yeah. Did it blow your mind just how many different elements of this story there are? I mean, you start out with this story of the factory collapse in Bangladesh, and you say that there'd been stories of ones previously in the years before that. But did it blow your mind just how far down the impact of this fast fashion industry sort of went. I mean, when I say that, what I've got in my mind is the statistics, and I'm not sure if I'm exaggerating this. I think I've got it right, but I read somewhere that roughly every 30 seconds, a farmer who's helping produce I'm not sure, is it the cotton or the fabrics or whatever it is, there's a suicide every 30 seconds roughly amongst these farmers?
Yeah. The India. Yeah, absolutely.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because that's one thing I'd never even considered. I mean, for me, it only went as far back as the factory workers. And I was like, yeah, that's really sad. But I mean, it is incredibly sad, but it's just as sad. You go to the stage before that and you hear about these farmers, and man, you'll explain that a lot better than I can. But what's the story that these guys and girls are actually going through in order to feel as though they've got no use going forward?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's really the experience that I had. So, when I started with that article, I was focused on Bangladesh that morning, and I was focused on the garment workers specifically. And then the more work that we did, it really had this kind of scandalous unraveling effect where, it was like, well, that leads to that, and then that leads to that. Like that question opens this new door, and it leads to this other question, and then that question. And really, I mean, honestly, the resulting film is very much, it's like this. I'm trying to replicate the journey that I had, because it really was that experience for me of starting very focused on just the labor in the garment sector, and then kind of moving out. And yeah, I mean, it's virtually unending, because any direction you extrapolate from is pretty wild. I mean, to your point, there's an incredible untold story in just the farming sectors, cotton specifically, the way that it's being grown. A lot of folks are really familiar with Monsanto, Syngenta, some of these major global seed companies, and there's been increasing awareness about their effect on food farmers, but cotton farmers are, historically some of the poorest farmers in the world. And we spent time in India, where there's a couple things happening. One is, they're buying into these global seed formulas where they're costing them enormous amounts. They're putting them in debt in astronomical ways with the promise of greater output. That brings with it the need for increased chemical input to these plants. I mean, it's a horrible cycle that these farmers get put into, where they used to be saving their own seeds and replanting crops every year. They're now, increasingly on this chemical input, and it's having a dramatic effect from a health standpoint. There's very little training and knowledge about safe uses of pesticides. And there is just an astronomical amount of the world's pesticides that are being used on cotton. And that has some health impacts for people wearing the clothing, but it also has dramatic impacts for some of these communities and some of these farming communities. I spent time in an area of India called Punjab, which was kind of heralded as the founding place of the Green Revolution, and it's historically been known as the breadbasket of India. So just an enormously rich landscape of agriculture, and you just see the effects of this poisonous material that's being sprayed with no safety materials flowing right into open waterways, getting into people's food. I mean, it's just an incredibly not just unregulated. I mean, that's an understatement. It's this wild picture of, I mean, you just walk around and you just see instance after instance after instance of people using these chemicals in really, really harmful ways. And that debt, I mean, back to your suicide question, that debt has led to, this is one of the poorest, groups of the working poor, and it has put them under enormous pressure. And the result has been the largest wave of recorded suicides in history has come from the cotton farming sector there. And, tragically, the kind of routine way it's done is the farmer drinks a bottle of the pesticide and ends his life. And I think there's such a collapse of dignity. There's such a loss of hope, that it puts them in a really desperate place. And that's just one part. Like, that's just the people who are growing cotton. And then you can go any direction in this story, and you just run into, this is not just about clothing. Fashion's not just fashion. It's this sum total of all these parts from an interconnected world. And in a market and in a moment where the only thing we're keeping track of is the price, when we're only measuring profit, there is all sorts of impact that goes uncounted and stories that go untold.
Man, and again, I mean, it's so easy to sit here, well, I'm in London at the moment and look at this and really distance myself from the stories that these farmers are telling and, both through their words and their actions. But I mean, on a real practical level and what hits me a little bit more close to home. And I think I heard you say on Rich Roll's podcast in the middle of last year, you were saying that, hey, the pesticides and stuff that these fabrics are being sprayed with, we're wrapping ourselves in it, every day. And that really struck me because I think there's been such a move recently on, going back to a little more organic and getting back to nature when it comes to the food we eat and things like that. But I mean, clothing is something that I hadn't even considered as being something that was potentially harming our health. I'm not sure, is there any statistics or is there any sort of research into that? But could you go on with that a little bit more, man? Because I've heard you say just how many pesticides, how many, problems that are occurring out of the stuff that's being sprayed on our clothes.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. And to be honest, I think it's one of the most exciting areas of research right now. There's not enough definitive research that's been done. I think you're exactly right. There's been a huge wake-up call around organic food. And I think we've seen a really exciting transition towards eating food that's not laced with chemicals. And we've started to really define scientifically the benefits and the differences there. And I think, it's pretty extraordinary to think about clothing and the skin on us being, the largest organ on our body. And we take in an enormous amount of our environment through our skin. It was really eye-opening to me to be in some of these clothing factories where some of the excess cutaway fabric that's not used on your clothing. So, if there's a stretch of fabric and they cut out a pattern and the excess is set aside, that excess has to be discarded as toxic waste. And I when I first heard that, I sat down with someone who was working on it. And I was like, help me understand, how is this pile going to the stores to be bought and sold, and how is this pile going? And they just said there's no way that you cannot label this type of material as toxic by the amount of things that are going into it. And that's both the chemicals as well as just the synthetics and the plastics and the dyes and the stuff that's being used. And there's been just an alarmingly low amount of regulation on that. And the result it's kind of twofold. It's like on one end, there's a growing group of people who are working on really definitively proving what an impact detrimentally that has to our health. And every time you're wearing something that has that kind of stuff in it, going back to the farmers, it has the same effect on everyone who's been working with it along the way. So when you see in the film, we follow an organic cotton farmer in Texas, and she is just profoundly working uphill in the industry right now to some great success to communicate that we've got to go back to a more organic way of making these materials.
So what do you tell someone? Because obviously I know you come from you got a big family over there in the States, and a lot of people that I've spoken to are like, okay, look, I really want to change the way I do things, but I just, especially families, especially parents with kids saying, man, I got to clothe my kids though. Like, how am I going to be able to afford spending so much more on so many clothes that my kids wear, especially when they're growing out of it? I mean, it's just easier for a lot of people to keep going to these cheap shops based on the fact that there's a limit in their budget, there's a limit in their resources of their own. Man, what adjustments have you made to the way that you shop that you might be able to share with people who are thinking, man, how can I actually change the way I'm operating?
Yeah, there was a friend of mine actually in London, right where you are, that said something to me once that I've never forgotten. She said, I don't want anyone to feel guilt, because guilt is the feeling you have when you've already decided that you're not going to do something about it. And, I think one of the most beautiful parts of the story is that, there's a lot of, I think to no fault of anyone's own, we're living in a moment of great compassion fatigue. There's so many issues that are constantly put in front of us, and there's so much unfinished work in our world that I think for a lot of people, you can hear about a story like this one, and you can sort of say, I don't have room in my life quite frankly, to take on another issue that's going to make my life, more problematic. Or, there's also people that I talk to just say, I just love clothing. I love beautiful fashion. I love design. It's something that means a lot to me. And so I don't think any of those things have to be sacrificed. My personal experience as going from someone who was just right in the middle of this, was when I started making the film, I just stopped buying stuff. I just said I want to take a year or two off and just sort of step back. And I think I'm going to get by, first of all, on the things that I already have. And I also just want to sort of evaluate what I think and where I do want to put my money. And then as I, have started stepping back into purchasing things, I buy a lot secondhand. There's just an incredible amount of clothes, especially in cities like Los Angeles and London, where you are, and most major cities around the world. There's an amazing amount of secondhand shops that are really they're getting better, and I can find almost everything that I need at a place like that. And then when I wanna buy something that's new, I spend a few minutes more and I look into the company. I find something that I'm gonna really love and hold on to for a while, and something that a story that I can support. And I think here's the thing for me, because I have 4 kids at home. I travel a lot. My wife is working. We're busy. We're not making huge amounts of money. So a couple things. One is, just by reducing the amount of cheap throwaway clothing that I'm bringing into my life, it has made room emotionally and economically to make a few better choices. I think what I started to realize is I looked at my closet and I said, I'm buying a bunch of cheap stuff every year and it feels great at the checkout, but it falls apart. Yeah. And if you're wondering, this stuff is actually engineered to fall apart. That's not a myth. That's not an accident. If you buy stuff and you wear it, and through the course of the year, it just doesn't hold up. That's by design. So if you begin to step back and get off that treadmill of kind of constantly bringing into your life a bunch of cheap throwaway stuff, you will be surprised just economically at the reality that you have the ability to invest in a few things that are better, that are made better, that are going to last longer, that you actually love. Like, this isn't about throwing away fashion. This is saying, I want to actually wear things that are beautiful through and through. And the other thing I would just say is, they always, that line, perfect is the enemy of good. I'm not perfect. And our kids, our family isn't perfect. And we're just like everyone else. We're navigating a very strange moment in history where the convenient thing is really destructive. And it takes a little more intention to move towards something with meaning. And what the truth is, we get excited when we make better choices, and I think that's what I would want for everyone. Don't go set your closet on fire. Don't go, just make a better choice. And that better choice will lead to another choice. Just like empathy breeds more empathy, I think action leads us to more action. And one of the things that I love most about this story is that it has made my life more rich. It has made my life better. It has not taken away. This is not me, failing to care about what I look like, or me turning my back on, this is about, honestly, I think, returning fashion to what it was and what it has been throughout history, and just boldly rejecting this corporate buyout that's really only a couple decades old.
Man, it absolutely blows my mind. A few minutes ago, you mentioned when you were saying when the film was released that there was obviously some pretty harsh feedback from some of the big businesses and things like that. Was there any feedback from, big companies or big names or anything that really struck out that was sort of positive or left you open to the thought that there could be some positive change in this industry?
Absolutely. I mean, there's been more of that than the other. And wow. I've been blown away by it. I was really surprised and kind of caught off guard by how much the actual fashion industry embraced this film. And we had, huge champions, all the way from, name drop here, people like Stella McCartney, Tom Ford, Anna Wintour, people that are really in some of the most powerful positions in this industry, really came to us right away. I mean, they were they were really generous. A lot of those folks from really powerful places in the industry came out to premiere events. They gave quotes to magazines for us. They did a lot because I think they feel like the industry they love has been bought out. And I think there is a sense in which they are ready for a new story. And that was incredibly powerful. The other thing that's been really, really powerful to me is this just growing movement of people all over the world, entrepreneurs, students studying fashion, people just coming into this industry, just profoundly rejecting the status quo and believing with all their heart that we can create models that are profitable, that also serves the needs of people, all the way through the supply chain. And I think if there's anything I'm most proud of, it's that the film, I think, just gave them a little bit of a shared vocabulary. I think, I hope, put some wind in their sails, because I think when you look at any industry historically that makes great change, it doesn't usually come from the large players that are still making staggering quarter-on-quarter profit. Their incentive to change is very little, and when they do, they're usually chasing marketing more than anything. What can disrupt, and what historically does disrupt industries, is when there is a growth in consciousness and there are outliers, there are outsiders, there are up-and-coming players who disrupt the model because they create something that is a great product and that is marketed and manufactured in a way that it fits well into people's lives. And I think we're just at the very beginning of that. And I get notes every day from designers and entrepreneurs all over the world. And I think they are poised to lead us forward. So I think, yes, there is absolutely hope for change. There is absolutely a new generation of people coming out of schools and going into this industry that I just think the mindset is very different. And I think it's going to be extraordinary to watch the changes they make. And as a person, I'm mindful of any time I can throw my support behind them, and whether that's buying something they make or whether that's supporting something that they put together.
Yeah, man. Look, it's an amazing story. It's amazing to look at the the fast fashion industry and all the levels of it. But I think the other side of this story that I'm just so fascinated in and so interested in is, man, just your side of the story, the creative side of the story. And you've put together this bloody incredible film, and it's made an impact on millions of people all around the world. And one thing I'm really curious to find out is just, man, on a personal level, what's it like to be getting all this attention for a film in a scene that you're just so passionate about?
It's great. I mean, I think, what I wake up with every day is a feeling of stewardship. When I stand in people's homes or factories, or when I get to look people in the eye in different parts of the world, and I get to hold a camera and ask them to share their story with me, there's a very sacred exchange that takes place. And on this film, even more than anything I had done before, there was a sense of desperation for some of these people that they really wanted the world to hear their story. And so I think for me, my work is very simple, really. It's just a matter of listening well. And then it's a matter of weaving together those voices in a way that is approachable and appealing to people that are watching. And I think what was really exciting about fashion is fashion gave us this it was like a Trojan horse. Really at the base, this is a film about human rights. This is a story about environmental destruction. This is a film about corporate power. But because it was fashion, we got to wrap it in something so beautiful and so enticing, because it's a part of our lives every single day, that suddenly I think, and I believe really a lot of people, get into the middle of it and they're not even sure what they had gotten themselves into. And I think watching that process of disguising it well, and also making it something that is inviting, that is hopeful, it's powerful, and every time I get to have a conversation like the one I'm having right now, my mind is just really full of all the people that don't get to have a voice, globally speaking. And for some reason, for some unknowable reason, I was born into a position, globally speaking, of real power and real influence. And I think part of the life change for me making this film and for my team was it just kind of raised the bar on how I think about my life every day. It kind of raised the bar, again, not on guilt, but on the kind of opportunity I've been born into. And I just, whether I'm talking to someone like you or whether I'm making a film, I just want to be a person that uses that opportunity well. And I think when I look back at the experience making this film and now having these conversations about it, I feel like we were able to do that. And that's a humbling, very personal, gratifying thing. And to be honest, it kind of gave me a taste for it in a way that I kind of want to relentlessly throw my life into.
Yeah, that's really awesome, man. I think you've sort of just set up a perfect foundation for my next question, because I felt like in the last few weeks, man, since I've been organising, getting ready to chat with you on this podcast, I've been really struck by how much love you seem to bring into, every interview. And I feel like that seems to be such a massive core of what it is that you do. And I think it's really refreshing, because I know on a personal level how it can be so exciting when one of your little creations or some of the work that you've done, it really takes off. But I think what stands out to me about what you do is just how much love you seem to bring to the table with, whether it's communicating with me through the emails and just giving me the time to have a chat, or whether it's through reaching out to these people that you speak to in order to get their story out there. But what I'm really interested in, man, is like, what drives this love? Is there anything that's actually rooted in, or are you just a bloody good bloke?
No, I'm not. What I think it is for me is two things really simply. I mean, I grew up as a person who the only thing that's ever made sense to me is stories. And ever since I was a little kid, I'm not exaggerating when I say I was not a good student. I was not there was a lot that I did not do well. And I remember very early on in my life watching a movie. It was actually, this is so cliche it hurts, but I was watching Steven Spielberg's E.T. And I remember sitting on the end of my bed crying my eyes out at the end of that movie. And I just thought, what is this thing? Like, it felt magical to me in a way. It evoked some kind of empathy and it spoke to something so at the core of who I was, even at that age, that I was one of those kids that ran out in the backyard with a camera and started shooting and making stuff. So on the one hand, I have this deep love for the art and the craft of telling stories. And I think I'm really fortunate in that, because as that has collided with a growing awareness and sense of urgency for some of what needs to be done in our world, they've created a perfect combination. But what makes it so fun to me, like what gives the joy, is that I love the process. Like, I love the thing we're making, and I love how we're making it. I mean, we spent a couple years, on this film alone, and that is, I mean, it's an extraordinary amount of work. And if you don't love the process, like if you're only fueled by the result, I think you burn out. And the truth is, I mean, to answer your earlier question, like, when it works, like when we're at Cannes and when people are responding to the film and when there's like these moments, it's so interesting, because to be totally honest with you, and I've never said this before, it's almost a little disappointing, because I think I like making the thing so much more.
I get you.
And I always get eager to get back to, like, yes, I want to, promote it and I want to do it justice. But the joy is in these days where we're sitting in a small room and we're going through thousands of hours of footage and we're finding that story. So I don't know. I love it. I almost feel ridiculous talking about how much I love it, because I feel like it's the most fun thing in the world. I mean, to make a documentary, it's like you're speaking with 1,000 voices, and man, I get to spend most of my life listening, and I get to spend most of my life putting myself in positions to learn. And that, I don't know, it does something. It's humbling on one side, because I think what it's done is, over the last couple of years, it's lowered my opinion of my own opinions. It's lessened the importance of my own. And what it's done is made me realize that, man, life looks very different when you're standing in different people's shoes. And there's a lot of different experiences unfolding on this planet right now. And what an extraordinary tool that we get to make something that could give you a taste of a human experience in someone else's life. And that is like intoxicatingly fun to me.
Oh my gosh, man, that's such a good answer, and I think it's so clear to me. Like, I love, you don't have to feel embarrassed about the fact, not embarrassed. What was it? You just, you felt like it was a bit over top how passionate you are. I'm sitting here in my little shed out the front of my house next to the router and just doing little fist pumps because it's so invigorating chatting with someone who's so passionate about what they do. But man, what was the age, or was there a particular moment when you thought, hang on, okay, like you've just watched AT, you've ran it into your backyard to make your films, but was there a point when you thought, hang on a second, this could be my actual job?
I think it was kind of early on. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think ignorance is bliss, and I think I decided very young that I was going to be a filmmaker, and that's a very arrogant thing now looking back on it. I had, there was no one. I grew up in Atlanta. My parents worked, but there was no one in my family that was really doing anything in the creative arts or anything like that. But I felt like that was what I was going to do. And I kind of, I don't know. I set out to do it, and I got enormously lucky in the way that, there were some very supportive people in my life. But I finished high school and I worked for a year. I opened a coffee shop every morning and bus tables at a steakhouse every night, and I saved a lot of money. And I met someone that was bartending there that had a dream of moving to LA, and we moved to Los Angeles, and I went to school here to study cinematography. And I think as soon as I remember like day one of that class, I just remember feeling like I had found my home, not just in the city of Los Angeles, but in the sense that these were all the people like me, these were all the people that had come from all these places with this far off, faint, big-hearted dreams, and they were all focused on storytelling. And then I think, what took place is I spent the next few years really learning how to do it. There was a lot of work that I had to do to learn the actual craft, and I think a lot of people can relate to that in whatever work they do. There's an interest and there's an ambition and a love, but then you actually have to learn how to do it physically. So I studied very nuts and bolts camera work, lighting. I worked after school with a lot of people, really just assisted and learned a lot from a lot of people. And it just kind of went from there. I don't think it's one of those things that I don't think I could do anything else. Yeah. And I say that with humility, actually, because it's not like I've had this. If I had a good plan B, I might have gone for it by now, but I don't think I ever did.
No, that's amazing, man. Was there one particular film, and this might be hard to answer because I guess we measure it in so many different ways, but just from your own perspective, was there one particular film that you made that when you released it, you thought, hang on, okay, I'm on the right track?
Yeah, there was. And this is, if you're okay with this being very personal, I made I lost my dad in a sudden accident. We were both cyclists, and we were biking, and very close to me on the road, he got struck and hit by a car, and it sent me into the most confusing, difficult, dark season of my life, and
Right.
and I was so ill prepared, and I was so overwhelmed by the size of the loss, and I didn't have a way. I didn't even know how to articulate it to myself. I felt completely unmoored, and I don't know how long it was after that experience. I think it was 6 months or a year. I made a decision that it's funny to say it as clearly now, but I woke up one day and I decided that I wanted to go spend time with people who had experienced loss in different ways, in different parts of the country, and who had made it through. And I think I was looking for a very personal set of answers. I mean, I think I ultimately, on the outside, I wanted to make a film about loss because I felt like no one was talking about it, and I couldn't believe that we were all experiencing this thing in our life, that we were so. It was one of the more defining moments, and yet we were so often. It wasn't allowed in our conversation. That was kind of how I described the film to myself. But I think on the inside, I was looking for answers, and I was really desperate to figure out how do I lose this person that I love so much without losing my whole self in the process. And I took the same two friends that we did the True Cost with, and we had so little money. We drove all the country. And I sat down and I had conversations with people, and we had done some reaching out online, and I had found some people and newspaper articles and stories. And I would just sit down and I would say, here's what I just experienced. Here's my story. And I would love it so much if you could tell me yours. And they did. And the experience I had in those interviews, still to this day, it was the first time I had felt that sacred exchange of a story. And it just left me, I don't know, it helped me put the pieces together in my own life. So from a very personal level, I think it kind of, it did something very healing for me. And then as it got released, it meant something to a lot of people that saw it. And I think the combination of those two things was really life-changing. And so to come full circle, I did that film right before The True Cost. And this is so interesting now. I literally had just signed the distribution deal. Like everything was finished on that day. The day before, I walked into the coffee shop and picked up the article about the clothing factory collapse. And what's interesting about that is when I look back on that, I think I was in a place to be ready to pick up that article because I was so raw, like because I had actually just gone through this thing that I don't know. I've never thought about it all that way, but it's interesting to look back on your life and kind of realize the pieces that feel like chaos at the time, but it's kind of building.
Yeah, really well said, man. What was it about chatting with the people who had experienced loss in the way that you were experiencing it? Was it just the fact that people understood what it was that you were going through that was so comforting?
I think it was that. I also think I realized something for the first time on that film, and that was that when there is a camera on, and this is a really interesting thing because, a lot of times people can be nervous if a camera's on, but when a camera's on, there is something that takes place where people have the desire for their story to be saved. And they have the desire for their experiences to be not just heard, but actually cataloged somehow. And it was this really interesting thing where I would have these conversations with people and, they would be in tears, I would be in tears. And by the end of the conversation, they would look at me and say, I've never said that stuff to anyone. And now, listen, this is not because I was a great interviewer, because in all honesty, I wasn't. I really didn't know what I was doing at that point at all. But I was just amazed at the power of that interaction. And then, to go back in post and put those interviews together, it was like, oh, like that thing I can weave with this thing and we can make this bigger. I don't know. It was just beginning to me of you can take something sacred and then you can weave it into something that is a story. And I don't know. I just still think I'm really I'm mystified by that process. But I think here's the part that there's no denying. I think what's really fascinating, and there's so much research being done on the amount of things that are taking place in our world from an energy standpoint that we don't see. But I think when something like that profound happens in the moment, happens in the room, I think when you watch the film 2 years, 3 years later on a different country, a different part of the world, I think you feel it. And I think you feel something that got bottled. You actually feel the experience of what someone else had. So yeah, I'm riveted by that.
Man, no, that's amazing. Have you got some storytellers? Are there any particular people that you recommend if we're interested in checking out some good stories that you would sort of put forward?
Oh my gosh, there's so many. I mean, what's so great about this moment in history is I think we are getting to hear from storytellers that we've never gotten a chance to hear from. So the amount of international voices, the amount of filmmakers that I watch stuff every day that my producer, my team makes fun of me because I'm pretty enthusiastic. Everything I watch, I come in the next day and I'm like, I just watched the best thing I've ever seen in my whole life. Yeah, no, there's so many. I think on the documentary side, though, it's a really, 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 really exciting time. I mean, we just went through Oscar weekend here in Los Angeles. Every single film that was nominated for an Oscar for Best Documentary this year was life-changing to me. Was completely life-changing to me. If folks haven't seen The 13th, if you haven't seen I'm Not Your Negro, if you haven't seen the O.J. Simpson story, I mean, just it was just astonishing. On a larger single scale, and this is a little a lot of folks probably know who this person is, but there's a filmmaker named Werner Herzog who
Oh,
is, I
bro,
think,
great, good.
it's probably one of my all-time favorites.
Yes.
I mean, I'm at this place now where like when he makes something, I just watch it. I don't even, it's
Oh,
um, I love there is a sense of madness like curiosity
uh-huh.
that he imparts in his work that has made my life so much more colorful. So yeah, I'd point to him specifically as one.
Oh man, I watched his just about a week ago. Actually, I don't know the name of it, but what's the one where he goes out with a Vietnam veteran and basically rewalks the journey that this guy went on 30 years earlier?
Yes. I'm blanking on the name as well, but I
I'm
know
going to find
exactly
it.
what you're talking
I'll
about.
put it
Yes.
in the show notes, but that was absolutely incredible. Man, hey, we don't have long left, so I just want to fire two more quick questions at you. And feel free to throw absolutely anyone out for this one. And I'm sorry to spring this on you because I was thinking before I asked you this question how hard it would be for me to do the exact same thing because there's probably so many things. What is it is there anything in particular that you're absolutely loving right now that we all need to go and check out?
Mm, that's a great question. Um, Man, I I don't know. I'm reading so much stuff and I'm watching so much stuff that's so specific. I'm working on something new right now, so it has me like really, really, really focused. So I don't have an amazing answer to that question. I have been personally really, really focused on issues around race here in the United States, and I've been really interested in issues around immigration. And I think that idea of who's inside and who's outside, who's the other, and how does that work throughout history, and what are our biases, have been really powerful. And honestly, I mean, last night I really did just finally finish the OJ Made in America series of films. I'd recommend that to anyone.
Mhm.
But yeah, I don't have like a great answer. I feel like every day I have like something new that's worth checking out. But I think in general, if I can just be a blanket billboard for documentary storytelling, I mean, I think if you're a person, if you've got Netflix or Amazon or any of these services, just watch some of the stories that are coming out from new and upcoming filmmakers because I just can't overstate the fact that I think it's some of the best storytelling that we've ever had in history. And yeah, I constantly feel overwhelmed by how compelling it is.
That's awesome, man. And hey, just before I let you go, lucky last, what's next on the calendar for you? I hear you're up to some pretty cool stuff over in the States right now.
Yeah, I'm working on a new documentary series right now called Untold America, and it's basically a pretty intense exploration of the people behind some of the issues that we face here as a country. And I think there's great echoes to that all over the world. I had an experience. I was finishing up a series of films on climate change. I was in Seoul, Korea, the day that the American election took place this year, and I just instantly felt like something had changed. And I felt like as a storyteller that has spent a lot of my time overseas, that I couldn't live through 2017 without telling stories in and about my country. And I think one of the things that we're seeing in this country right now is we're seeing this just unprecedented level of polarization, and we're seeing a real rise in not just differing ideas, but actually really people just not just disagreeing, but like actually hating each other, and groups of people being positioned against each other. And that's really dangerous to me for a couple reasons. One is because it leads us down a really dark road that leads away from democracy towards a place we don't want to go. It makes us much more susceptible to faulty authoritarian stories, of which there are a couple being peddled at the moment. But also, it reinforces the status quo. We're at a moment in history where we have some serious work to do, and we don't have too long to do it. When you look at issues around the environment, and when you look at around issues as we kind of put the final pieces to cement the organization of the world in relation to how business is going to be free to operate, and where the limits between the rights and needs of people are going to collide against not just growing inequality, but a growing world that is being engineered away from those needs. I feel like the only way that we're going to see the kind of movement and work we need, both in this country and around the world, is if we can find a way through that polarization, if we can reject that kind of hate, that kind of vitriol, that kind of tribal thinking, and get to a place of saying we have differences. There's different opinions, beliefs, and ideas, but we've got some work to do together that's bigger than all of those things. So I'm spending time making a show. We're doing it in a really cool way, which is we're putting it online every week for free. People can find it on Facebook, untouldamerica.com. And they're just stories. We're kind of going each month. We take one focus. We're starting a month right now focused on immigration. We're going to do race. We're going to do environment. We're going to do a whole bunch of different things. And I'm really spending time trying to focus on the people behind those issues. I think we're trying to humanize the headlines a little bit, because I think my experience, as we've talked about, has been that the only thing that's really changed my life is when I can look at something not just as a topic, but I can see a human being that's involved. And I think there's a lot of work to do there. And I think we're at a moment in history where I think whoever you are, whatever you're working on today, I would just beg for you to be the kind of person who is relentlessly focused on the issues and the unfinished work, and yet someone who is doing that work in a way that invites more humanity, more compassion, more empathy, and more love, because we really need all of it that we can get right now. And so, yeah, that's what I'm focused on this year.
Oh, bro, so good. I'm looking at my sheet of paper in front of me. I've still got about 483 questions, but maybe I can save those for another day. Dude, I'd love to touch base with you maybe in 6 months or a year or whatever, and just follow along, because I feel like there's just so much that you say that I'd love to tap into more. But dude, hey, so grateful for you to stop by and have a chat today, man.
It's so good to talk to you, and I really love the kind of conversation that you're building. So keep it up, and let's be in touch, and hopefully let's see each other in London there soon.
Oh, dude, yeah, let me know. Thanks again, brother. So grateful. I know. What an absolute superstar, guys. I hope you absolutely love that. I'm sure you did. He's just a superstar. What's equally as impressive as the guy is his hairstyle. If you want to see that, check out the show notes, tysonpopplestone.com/podcast. Click on the episode. His hair's incredible. I'm so jealous. A good looking unit, ladies. Actually, it's far too late. He's married. He's got 4 kids, but you can still appreciate it. Anyway, that's a ridiculous comment. If you want to join the newsletter, tysonpopplestone.com/newsletter is where you find that. That'll just get me sending you updates and blog posts and podcasts to your inbox. If you're into it, it might make your life a little bit easier, so sign up there. Guys, also, feel free to send me some tips and tricks and stuff that I need to learn. This podcast is so new. Honestly, I'm getting the hang of it, but still don't really know what I'm doing. So I'm so open to any advice that you want to throw my way. Tyson.popplestone@gmail.com is where you can send that advice. If you want to leave a rating and a review on iTunes, I'll be your best friend. Anyway, guys, big love from London. I'll speak to you soon.